Tonight, we begin with something ancient Rome quietly excelled at: conspiracies. Not the modern kind, built on blurry theories and endlessly debated in digital comment sections, but the real kind. The kind where the stakes were absolute power or sudden death, whispered in marble corridors under the flicker of oil lamps. This was an environment where the most dangerous secrets were often the ones everyone already knew. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum that helps the world fade away, and let us ease into tonight's journey together, deep into a past that is as astonishing as it is real. In the year 44 before Christ, the city of Rome, though powerful beyond measure, was an unsettled place. The sprawling Roman Republic was beginning to fracture under the weight of its own ambition, and at the center of this gathering storm was one man, Julius Caesar. He was a brilliant general, a charismatic leader, and by this point in his life, he had accumulated an amount of power that made the cherished Roman Republic look less like a functioning republic and more like a suggestion. He had recently been declared dictator for life. Honors were piling up unceasingly. Statues were erected in his honor. Grand titles were bestowed upon him, and there were subtle yet terrifying hints, at least terrifying to the Roman elite, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't planning to give that power back, ever. The elite, the senators and the old families of Rome, did not love that. They watched this concentration of power with deep, simmering resentment and fear, because Romans had a long-standing cultural allergy to kings. Centuries prior, they had overthrown their last king and swore never again to be ruled by one man. So, naturally, instead of sending a strongly worded letter of protest or trying to negotiate, they did what powerful Romans in that era often did when faced with an immovable obstacle. They started planning his assassination. Whispers began to spread through the shadows of the Senate. Quiet meetings were held in private homes, away from prying eyes, marked by anxious glances and the intense, muted gravity of treason. This created a palpable atmosphere, the kind of environment where everyone intuitively feels something is profoundly off, but continues attending meetings and going about their business anyway, which in itself is very Roman behavior. Except here is the part that makes this one of the most remarkable and almost ridiculous conspiracies in all of Roman history. It wasn't that the plot was so brilliant or so secret, it was that it was incredibly obvious. Caesar was warned multiple times by forces both mystical and mundane. He was famously told by a soothsayer, a seer of the signs, to beware the Ides of March. This was not some vague, cryptic prophecy about a generic threat. It was ancient Rome's version of a large, flashing red warning sign pointing specifically at one date, March 15th. Then, according to historical sources, there was the note. On the very day itself, as Caesar was walking towards the theater of Pompeii where the Senate was meeting, someone in the crowd tried to hand him a written warning, a document that allegedly contained details of the entire plot, naming names and outlining the plan. But Caesar, busy with the crush of the crowd, didn't read it in time. It suggests that even in ancient Rome, the most critical documents were occasionally ignored at the worst possible moment. And then there was his wife, Calpurnia. In the hours before the meeting, she suffered terrible, vivid nightmares about his death and awoke in a panic, begging him, pleading with him not to go to the Senate that day. At this point, Caesar had a specific prophecy, a physical written warning that he was carrying, a concerned and terrified spouse, and yet he still thought, "Yes, I will attend this meeting." Confidence, of course, is an admirable trait, especially in a ruler, but this might have been something else entirely, a sense of invincibility that blinds men to the obvious. Finally, consider the conspirators themselves. These were not mysterious, shadowed figures hiding in the deepest alleys of the city. They were senators, colleagues, men Caesar saw regularly in the course of his official duties, men he often considered friends, or at the very least, political allies. This included individuals like Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. This wasn't a hidden conspiracy. It was more like a poorly kept group project that everyone in the higher circles of Rome knew about, but no one wanted to be the one to interrupt. So, on the Ides of March, Caesar walked into the temporary Senate chamber at the Theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting. He arrived without guards, without any real expression of concern, carrying only the supreme confidence of a man who genuinely believed he was untouchable. He was the master of Rome, and Rome, he thought, would not strike him down. Within moments of him taking his seat, the rumors stopped being rumors. The whispered words of treason became literal, physical knives. The conspiracy that had been discussed, hinted at, and practically announced by everyone from mystics to family members finally happened. Because in ancient Rome, the most dangerous plots weren't always the secret ones. They were the ones everyone knew about, the ones whispered in the streets, and somehow they still went ahead exactly as planned anyway.
After the assassination of Caesar, the marble floors of the Senate were stained not just with blood, but with the sudden, terrifying realization that the world had broken. Rome entered a phase historians politely call instability. This is, of course, a very calm, academic way of describing years of brutal civil wars, rapidly shifting alliances, and a general suffocating atmosphere of simply waiting to see who would survive the chaos. The republic they had killed Caesar to save was dead anyway, bleeding out alongside him. Out of that violent, echoing void emerged a young man named Octavian, who would soon become known to history as Augustus. If you had stopped Augustus in the street and asked him what he was doing, he would have told you something deeply reassuring, something that sounded like the perfect antidote to decades of civil war. He would tell you he was restoring the Republic. He was giving power back to the Senate. He was stabilizing Rome. He was most definitely not becoming a king. Which, to be fair, is exactly what someone becoming a king would say, to avoid being stabbed on the Senate floor. Augustus was an absolute master of presentation. Unlike Julius Caesar, who had collected power loudly and openly, wearing it like a crown and making everyone nervous, Augustus moved differently. He moved slowly, carefully, almost politely. He accepted titles one at a time, spaced out over years. He publicly refused power until the Senate practically begged him to take it, making it seem as though it were a burden he was reluctantly shouldering for the good of the people. He positioned himself merely as the first citizen, the protector of the Republic, while quietly, systematically, making sure that absolutely nothing of importance happened in the known world without his permission. It was an illusion woven so perfectly that it became reality. It was subtle, so incredibly subtle that many people at the time managed to convince themselves that nothing unusual was happening at all, except for the rather small, easily overlooked detail that Augustus now personally controlled the entire Roman army, the vast treasury, and most, if not all, political decisions. But other than that, Everything was completely normal. There were rumors, of course. Whispered conversations in dimly lit villas suggested that this whole act of restoring the Republic was exactly that, a theatrical performance. People muttered that Augustus had absolutely no intention of ever stepping aside, that he was building something entirely new, a monarchy, just with much better branding and a gentler smile. At the time, these suspicions sounded a bit cynical to the average citizen because Augustus was so meticulously careful. He respected the old traditions. He wore humble clothing woven by his family. He avoided the title of king entirely. He kept the Senate functioning, debating and voting, making everything look comforting and familiar. And that was the true genius of his rule. People do not panic when things look familiar, even if the entire foundation underneath them has shifted entirely. Over time, however, the reality became impossible to ignore. Augustus wasn't temporarily holding power to guide the state through a crisis. He was the system itself. The Republic still existed, technically, on paper, but real authority had shifted permanently. And those early conspiracy theories, that he was quietly, methodically transforming Rome into an empire, turned out to be completely, flawlessly accurate. He didn't destroy the Republic dramatically. He replaced it slowly, which is far more effective and infinitely harder to stop. Because by the time people finally realize what is happening, the work is already done. Yet, if you were living in Rome during the long, seemingly peaceful reign of Augustus, you might have noticed something else, something quietly disturbing. People around him, particularly those in his family tree, had a strange habit of dying. Not dramatically, not loudly, just conveniently. And standing very calmly, perfectly composed in the background of all this sudden mortality, was his wife, Livia Drusilla. Officially, Livia was the very model of Roman virtue. She was everything a Roman elite woman was supposed to be. Dignified, intelligent, fiercely loyal, supportive, always present, always composed, and always standing exactly where the power was. Unofficially, there were rumors, the dark, creeping kind of rumors that slip under doors and echo in the quiet hours of the night. Because Augustus, for all his ultimate power, had a glaring vulnerability, a succession problem. To stabilize his carefully constructed, disguised empire, he needed a clear heir. But several of his chosen successors, young, promising men beloved by the public, kept dying before they could actually succeed him. One after another, they fell ill. This succession of tragedies statistically starts to feel less like a run of terrible luck and much more like a carefully executed pattern. Names like Gaius and Lucius Caesar, his own grandsons and potential heirs, died unexpectedly of sudden illnesses while away from Rome. Others were removed from the line of succession under circumstances that made the surviving elite very curious and very quiet. And who benefited from all of this tragic, convenient death? Eventually, the path cleared perfectly for Tiberius, Livia's own son from a previous marriage. This is where the whispers in Rome became very specific and very dangerous. People began murmuring that Livia was not just a passive observer of these tragic events, she was actively influencing them, possibly arranging them, and almost certainly accelerating them. Poison was the favorite, most logical explanation. In Rome, poison was the quietest, most elegant solution to a messy political problem. It required no public confrontation, no obvious conflict, no drawn swords, just a sudden, unexplainable illness, a few days of fever, a grand funeral, and a shifted line of succession. At the time, these accusations against the Empress were nearly impossible to prove, which is exactly what made them so effective and terrifying as rumors. Was Livia actually responsible? We don't have definitive, undeniable proof, but modern historians and ancient gossips tend to agree on one chilling thing. The suspicions were not at all unreasonable. The pattern is simply too difficult to ignore. Potential heirs disappear, her son rises, power consolidates, and through it all, Livia remains perfectly calm, widely respected, and very, very close to the center of absolute authority. She represents a type of power that is incredibly easy to overlook. Quiet, patient, indirect, the kind of power that never needs to announce itself to the room. In a world full of very loud, chaotic conspiracies, sometimes the most deadly and effective ones are the ones that barely make a sound.
When Tiberius finally assumed the ultimate mantle of power and became emperor, the people of Rome quickly developed a theory about him. The whispers in the forums and the quiet conversations in the bathhouses all centered around one unsettling idea. He was paranoid. He seemed suspicious of everyone who approached him, constantly worried about hidden plots, unseen daggers, and whispered betrayals. He began ordering trials, investigations, and executions that seemed, even to the hardened citizens of Rome, excessive. From the outside, looking up at the grand palaces of the Palatine Hill, it looked like classic imperial overreaction. It looked like the behavior of a ruler who sees danger in every shadow, who hears treason in every silence, and who imagines enemies even when none exist. Except, in ancient Rome, making that assumption comes with a very heavy, very real problem. Because very often, the danger was actually there. The shadows did have knives. Tiberius had inherited an empire that had just barely survived decades of brutal civil wars, vicious power struggles, and a carefully managed, incredibly tense transition from a republic to a monarchy that nobody officially dared to call a monarchy. This meant that trust was already in dangerously short supply. The foundation of his power was built on the unsettled graves of his predecessors. And on top of that lingering unease, the Roman political system actively encouraged fierce, relentless competition. Ambition wasn't something you hid away or felt ashamed of. It was expected. It was the very lifeblood of the city. Senators desperately wanted influence. Generals hungered for military glory and the power it brought. Advisors schemed for physical proximity to the emperor. And when you combine that level of ruthless ambition with the absolute, intoxicating opportunity of supreme power, you get conspiracies. Real, breathing, calculating conspiracies. So when Tiberius started acting cautiously, when he began watching the people around him with cold, calculating eyes, reacting swiftly to perceived threats, and allowing the dreaded treason trials to expand their reach, many assumed he had simply gone too far. They thought he was ruling entirely through fear, imagining phantoms in the dark. But here is where history becomes deeply uncomfortable. Some of those threats were entirely real. The plots did exist. Rivalries did turn into deadly schemes. Ambitious men did look at the aging emperor and think, quietly to themselves, I could do better. Which means Tiberius wasn't operating in a safe, predictable environment where paranoia is a flaw. He was operating in a remarkably dangerous one, where a lack of paranoia was a death sentence.
Instead of trusting people and hoping for the best, he chose the safest route available to a man in his position. He stopped trusting anyone completely. Over time, the sheer exhaustion of this constant vigilance took its toll. The endless games of politics, the fake smiles, the hidden daggers, it was too much. Tiberius did something unprecedented. He withdrew from the city of Rome entirely. He left the suffocating heat and the whispering crowds of the capital and relocated to the isolated, beautiful island of Capri. Surrounded by the deep, calming blue of the Mediterranean Sea, he governed his vast empire from a distance. He relied on couriers, reports, a handful of advisors, and a system that increasingly revolved around deep, unyielding suspicion. But escaping Rome physically did not mean escaping its nature. In fact, ruling from an island only made things worse. The more he withdrew into the quiet isolation of Capri, the more the rumors spread back in the capital. And the more those rumors spread, the more suspicious and closed off he became. It was a perfect self-sustaining cycle of isolation and fear. But here is the key fascinating detail. The conspiracy theory that Tiberius was surrounded by plots and active threats, that people were actively trying to undermine his rule, that he fundamentally couldn't trust the very system he governed, it wasn't entirely wrong. In fact, it might have been one of the most accurate, clear-eyed assessments of Roman politics at that specific time. Because in a world where power constantly shifts like sand and loyalty is entirely negotiable, paranoia stops being an irrational fear and starts being basic, necessary preparation. While Tiberius slowly walked the high cliffs of Capri, listening to the waves crash against the rocks far below, the city of Rome didn't exactly pause to wait for him. Power, by its very nature, despises an empty space. It abhors a vacuum. It rushes in to fill it. And in this specific case, that massive, echoing void of power was filled by a man named Sejanus. Officially, on paper, Sejanus held an important but subordinate role. He was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, the elite, heavily armed military unit specifically responsible for protecting the life of the emperor. Unofficially, however, he was rapidly becoming something much more interesting and much more dangerous. As Tiberius distanced himself further and further from the daily, grinding machinery of Roman politics, Sejanus remained right there in the city. He became the vital conduit. He handled the communication, managed who was allowed access to the emperor on his island retreat, and quietly began influencing major decisions. This sounds like a purely administrative role, a glorified secretary, until you pause to realize what that position actually means in an empire. If you control who speaks to the emperor, you completely control what the emperor hears. And if you control what the most powerful man in the world hears, you start shaping his reality. Sejanus understood this dynamic perfectly. He consolidated his power with quiet, ruthless efficiency. He took the scattered cohorts of the Praetorian Guard and reorganized them, bringing them together into a single, massive, fortified camp just outside the city walls of Rome. This move made the Guard far more efficient, but more importantly, it made them fiercely loyal to him directly. With an army at his back, he began to remove his political rivals one by one, often using those very same treason trials Tiberius had encouraged. He influenced the courts, positioned his allies in key roles, and made himself utterly indispensable to the absent emperor. From the outside, looking at official documents, it looked like he was simply a loyal servant, helping to manage a massive empire for a tired old man. From the inside, however, it looked exactly like he was patiently, methodically building his own. Naturally, rumors began to spread through the streets and the Senate floor. People whispered that Sejanus wasn't just loyal, he was ambitious. That he wasn't just serving the emperor, he was preparing the ground to replace him. At the time, these rumors sounded like the usual Roman paranoia, just another powerful figure being accused of wanting more than his official station allowed. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Those suspicions were not wrong. Sejanus had indeed begun maneuvering himself closer and closer to the imperial family. He pursued strategic marriage alliances, eliminated potential heirs, and positioned himself as the natural, inevitable center of power in Rome, while Tiberius remained a distant ghost on an island. Step by careful step, he moved from being a trusted advisor to a powerful gatekeeper to a very real potential successor. The inherent problem with subtle, quiet power is that it works perfectly until someone finally notices. And eventually, staring out at the sea from Capri, Tiberius did.
From the high, wind-swept cliffs of Capri, the aging emperor finally began receiving the reports. They came not as loud declarations, but as quiet warnings. Subtle indications slipped into routine correspondence, whispering that Sejanus might not be as completely loyal as his carefully constructed public image suggested. In Rome, you can spend a lifetime rising quietly through the ranks, accumulating power in the shadows, but when you fall, it is usually very, very loud. Tiberius, recognizing the vast web of influence his commander had built, did not strike immediately with an army. He struck with a piece of paper. A long, rambling letter was delivered to the Senate, read aloud in the echoing chamber, while Sejanus sat listening, entirely confident that it would end with a new promotion or honor for himself. Instead, sentence by slow sentence, the letter turned against him. By the time the final words were spoken, the Praetorian Guard had already shifted their allegiance back to the emperor. The man who had virtually ruled Rome an hour before was arrested, dragged from the marble halls, and executed. It was one of the most sudden and dramatic reversals in Roman history. A chilling reminder that the emperor's paranoia was not a weakness, it was a weapon. And when that weapon was finally swung, it severed the very roots of the conspiracy. When that era of cold, calculating suspicion finally passed, Rome found itself eventually in the hands of a man who approached power very differently. When people today think of the Emperor Nero, they usually imagine chaos. They picture massive, roaring fires consuming the city, public executions, strange music echoing through the palaces, and a never-ending string of highly questionable, deeply unstable decisions. For a long, long time, historians sat in quiet libraries and debated whether this terrifying reputation was somehow exaggerated. Was Nero really that completely unhinged, or was he simply the unfortunate victim of hostile sources, bitter senators, and political propaganda written by those who survived him? Roman writers, after all, had a well-known tendency to dramatize the lives of the rulers they despised, turning political disagreements into theatrical tales of madness. But as the dust of centuries settled, a very uncomfortable answer began to emerge from the archives. Some of those wild, almost unbelievable rumors about Nero, they were probably entirely true. Even during the early, seemingly golden years of his reign, people in the dimly lit taverns and wealthy estates of Rome whispered that the young emperor was deeply involved in a series of very convenient, very sudden deaths. Rivals, close advisors, and even family members, people who quite frankly had a bad habit of becoming political obstacles, kept expiring. The most famous and perhaps the most chilling example of this was his own mother, Agrippina the Younger. Now, Roman politics between family members was already incredibly complicated, a tangled web of duty, ambition, and survival.
But even by those notoriously low standards, the situation between Nero and Agrippina escalated with terrifying speed. Agrippina was a woman who understood power. She had maneuvered, schemed, and likely murdered to place her son on the ultimate throne of the world. Because of this, she expected to rule right alongside him, a quiet co-emperor directing his every move. At first, Nero merely tried to distance himself from her suffocating influence, pushing her away from the center of the court. But Agrippina was not a woman who accepted being sidelined. When the tension became unbearable, according to ancient accounts, Nero decided on a permanent solution. He tried to have her killed, and not just once. One of the documented attempts allegedly involved a specially designed, exquisitely crafted collapsing boat. It is, undeniably, a very creative, almost theatrical solution to a family disagreement. Imagine the scene, a beautiful, warm evening on the sparkling Bay of Naples. The water is calm, reflecting the light of 1,000,000 stars. Agrippina is invited aboard a luxurious vessel, surrounded by the soft sounds of the sea and the gentle creaking of timber. The plan was for the heavy lead canopy of the boat to collapse entirely, crushing her while making it look like a tragic, unavoidable maritime accident. It was the kind of complex, over-engineered conspiracy that feels more like a myth than reality. Unfortunately for Nero, and perhaps fortunately for history, the boat plan failed. The heavy canopy fell, but the sturdy arms of a wooden sofa protected Agrippina from the crushing weight. The boat sank into the dark, cool waters of the Mediterranean, but Agrippina, bruised and terrified, managed to swim to the safety of the shore. Surviving an incredibly elaborate assassination attempt orchestrated by your own son makes for an incredibly awkward family dynamic. With the theatrical approach having failed so spectacularly, Nero dropped the pretense of accidents. He chose a much more direct, brutal approach and simply sent armed men to her villa to have her assassinated. And while ancient sources do sometimes exaggerate the finer details for dramatic effect, modern historians generally agree on one unsettling thing. This part, the core of the story, is very likely true. A son murdering the mother who crowned him. It tells you absolutely everything you need to know about the toxic, unforgiving environment Nero was operating within. But the darkness of his reign did not stop there. The rumors of his involvement continued to swirl, surrounding the sudden deaths of other prominent figures close to him. This included his young wife, Octavia, who was exiled and quietly executed to make way for a new marriage, as well as various political opponents who simply vanished or were forced to end their own lives. At the time, some people desperately tried to dismiss these grim stories as mere gossip, simply because they sounded too extreme, too horrific for a civilized society to accept. But as more evidence accumulated and the analysis of his reign deepened, the bloody pattern became undeniably clear. Nero wasn't just reacting to threats as they appeared in the shadows, he was removing them proactively. He was clearing the board before the game even started, which is a much more controlled, terrifying form of chaos. So the conspiracy theory that Nero was secretly, methodically orchestrating the deaths of everyone around him, it wasn't entirely a theory at all. It was much closer to a deliberate political strategy. Because in ancient Rome, absolute power was rarely, if ever, maintained through trust. It was maintained through absolute control. And sometimes that control was very, very final. In the sweltering heat of the year 64 after Christ, the city of Rome burned. And this was not a metaphorical burning. It was very, very literal. a massive fire broke out in the dense, crowded streets of the capital, starting near the Circus Maximus and spreading rapidly through the valleys and hills. The architecture of the ancient city practically invited disaster. Tall wooden apartment buildings known as insulae, narrow winding alleys, and closely packed neighborhoods turned Rome into something dangerously flammable. Driven by strong winds, the flames leaped from rooftop to rooftop, creating a roaring inferno that turned the night sky into a terrifying, unnatural day. Within days, large, historic parts of the city were completely destroyed. Homes that had stood for generations, ancient temples housing the gods, bustling shops and grand monuments, all gone, reduced to smoldering gray ash. And as the roaring flames finally began to die down, replaced by the soft, eerie crackle of cooling embers, the rumors began. Because in the political landscape of Rome, massive disasters were rarely viewed as simple, unfortunate accidents. They were viewed as opportunities. And the terrified, displaced citizens quickly started asking a very specific, very uncomfortable question under the cover of the smoke-filled darkness. Did Nero start the fire himself? Now, at the time, this sounded like an incredibly wild, almost treasonous accusation. An emperor purposefully burning his own magnificent capital city down to the ground? That seems entirely counterproductive, an act of sheer madness. But then, as the ash settled, people started noticing a few deeply unsettling details. First, and perhaps most importantly, Nero benefited from the fire a lot. The sheer scale of the destruction allowed for something he had always wanted: large-scale, unrestricted rebuilding. Narrow streets could be redesigned into grand avenues, overcrowded areas could be beautifully cleared, and most conveniently of all, Nero suddenly had the massive, empty space right in the center of the city to begin constructing his dream. He began building his enormous, sprawling, unprecedentedly luxurious palace complex, the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House, right in the newly available space. It featured an artificial lake, rotating dining rooms, and sprawling manicured landscapes. It was a very convenient, very profitable outcome for a man who previously had no room to build. Second, his behavior during the crisis raised countless eyebrows across the surviving population. Ancient sources claim that while the city burned, Nero dressed in theatrical robes and performed, playing his lyre and singing about the destruction of Troy. Whether he was actually singing or not, the details are heavily debated by modern scholars, but the deeply unsettling image stuck in the collective memory of the people. An emperor casually watching his city burn to the ground while enjoying the dramatic, aesthetic moment of it all. It was not a great look for a ruler who was supposed to be protecting his flock. Third, and perhaps the most telling detail of all, Nero desperately needed someone to blame. The public anger was reaching a boiling point, and the rumors pointing at him were growing too loud to ignore. So he blamed the Christians. At the time, they were a small, relatively new, and already deeply unpopular religious group in the city. They were officially accused of starting the fire and were punished with brutal severity. From a cold, calculating political perspective, it was an effective maneuver, but it was also incredibly suspicious. Because when a powerful leader so quickly and neatly assigns blame to a convenient, marginalized group, it often raises the quiet, lingering question: why so fast?
To be completely fair to history, modern historians do not have any definitive, physical proof that Nero actually ordered the fire. Rome was a highly flammable city, and fires were an unfortunately common occurrence in the ancient world.
This one may have simply been a tragic accident that, fanned by the wind, got completely out of control. But here is the key lasting detail. The suspicion never ever disappeared. Even in ancient times, the people firmly believed something was profoundly off. They felt that the fire had been just a little too convenient, too perfectly beneficial, too flawlessly aligned with exactly what Nero wanted to build next. And while we may never have absolute certainty, the conspiracy theory that Nero had a hand in it has remained entirely plausible for over 2,000 years. This is an impressive yet slightly concerning fact, because it reminds us that sometimes in history, the line between a tragic accident and a brilliant opportunity gets very, very blurry. This deep, ingrained culture of suspicion in Rome was not just reserved for grand disasters like citywide fires. It permeated every aspect of elite life, especially when it came to sudden, unexplained events. If you lived in ancient Rome and someone important, a wealthy senator, a popular general, or a potential heir, died suddenly, there was a standard, immediate reaction: poison. There was no call for a deep medical investigation, no genuine confusion about the frailty of human health, just the quiet, absolute certainty of poison. Because in the highest echelons of Roman society, poisoning wasn't rare, it was shockingly normal. Romans were absolutely convinced that their elites were quietly, politely eliminating each other with carefully measured toxins. And for a long time, later historians thought this might be an exaggerated, overly dramatic view of the past, the kind of wild thing people say when they don't understand the sudden onset of natural diseases. But here is the problem. The Romans were probably entirely right. Poisoning in the Roman world was a disturbingly common practice, especially among the upper classes who had the means to procure it and the motives to use it. It was incredibly discreet, highly effective, and most importantly, it was perfectly deniable. There was no messy public fight, no visible violence, no blood on the marble floors. There was just a sudden illness, a few days of fever, followed by a somber funeral, and a lot of very careful, heavy silence. This made it the absolute perfect tool for delicate political situations. If you had an unwanted heir, a rival gaining too much influence in the Senate, or a wealthy relative becoming incredibly inconvenient, there was a quiet solution available, and it didn't require raising an army. One of the most infamous figures historically associated with this dark art was a woman named Locusta. Yes, ancient Rome had professional, highly sought-after poisoners, which already tells you absolutely everything you need to know about how often this grim method was used. Locusta was employed by some of the most powerful figures in the empire, purportedly including Nero himself, to create specialized poisons tailored to very specific situations: fast-acting, slow-acting, subtle, very subtle. The kind of dark, bespoke customization you really do not want to exist in a functioning society. There are incredibly strong indications that poison was used in several high-profile imperial deaths, most notably that of the Emperor Claudius, Nero's predecessor. Ancient sources strongly suggest that a plate of poisoned mushrooms was involved in his demise, which means that in Rome, even a quiet dinner could be a deadly battlefield. And suddenly, receiving those elegant Roman dinner invitations starts to feel a lot more stressful than flattering.
At the time, these endless accusations of poisoning were often dismissed by the more rational minds as mere rumors, simply because they sounded far too dramatic, far too convenient, and frankly, far too easy. But as more historical evidence has been meticulously studied and the dark patterns of Roman succession examined over the centuries, historians have increasingly accepted a chilling reality.
Poisoning was not just an occasional desperate act of a madman. It was an integral, almost administrative part of the political system itself. It was a quiet, highly efficient way to solve massive political problems that would otherwise require open conflict, civil war, or the costly raising of armies. Which means that the grand conspiracy theory that powerful Romans were constantly, systematically poisoning each other in the shadows was not paranoia at all. It was basic, necessary awareness. Because in a world where absolute power is everything and trust is fundamentally limited, sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the entire empire is not a sharpened iron sword, it is a beautifully prepared dinner. By the time the Emperor Commodus came to power in the late 2nd century, Rome had already developed a very strong, very justified tradition of political suspicion. People simply assumed plots existed, because historically they almost always did. And Commodus did absolutely nothing to calm those deep-seated fears. In fact, he made them worse, much, much worse. Commodus ruled like a man who had suddenly discovered the absolute limits of power and immediately decided to completely ignore them, choosing to use his boundless authority in the most unpredictable, chaotic ways imaginable. He began to style himself as a living god, specifically equating himself with Hercules. He brazenly renamed the months of the year, the fleets, and even the eternal city of Rome itself after his own name. But perhaps most shockingly of all, he actively participated in gladiator fights. And he did not do this from the safety of the imperial box as a wealthy spectator. He stripped off his purple robes, stepped down onto the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum arena, and performed as a gladiator himself. For an emperor, this was about as appropriate and dignified as a modern corporate CEO deciding to personally resolve customer service complaints in a bare-knuckle boxing ring. While the common people were occasionally entertained by this bizarre, violent spectacle, it made the Roman elite deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. And when the elite in Rome become uncomfortable, they do not just sit back and write letters of complaint. They start talking quietly. Then they start talking a little less quietly. Rumors began to spread like wildfire through the marble bathhouses and grand country estates that Commodus was fundamentally unstable, incredibly dangerous, and a direct threat not just to individual senators, but to the entire survival of the Roman system. At the time, these rumors might have sounded slightly exaggerated to the average citizen in the street, because surely the emperor wouldn't be that reckless. Surely there were boundaries he wouldn't cross. But there were not. Commodus increasingly sidelined the ancient authority of the Senate, relied entirely on a shifting circle of sycophants and favorites, and made monumental decisions that seemed driven far more by personal erratic impulse than any kind of long-term strategic thought. This is naturally not ideal when you are responsible for running a vast, delicate empire stretching across 3 continents. So naturally, the people closest to him started thinking about solutions, permanent ones. And this time, the conspiracy wasn't deeply hidden in the shadows or whispered in coded language. It was practically expected, even anticipated by the entire city. Eventually, a small, highly effective group formed that included the very members of his inner circle, people close enough to know his daily routines, his personal habits, and most importantly, his physical vulnerabilities. Because if you are going to remove a living god from the throne, it helps tremendously to know exactly when he is going to be alone. The plan they devised was brutal and simple. Poison first, slipped quietly into his wine after a heavy meal. But Commodus, perhaps accustomed to physical excess, vomited the poisoned wine up before it could fully take hold and stop his heart. When the quiet method failed to work quickly enough, the conspirators panicked and resorted to more direct physical action. They sent in a professional wrestler named Narcissus. Commodus was strangled to death in his own bath. The warm, steaming waters of the bathhouse provided no sanctuary. It is certainly not a dignified ending for a man who genuinely believed he was a divine hero. But then again, Roman politics rarely offered dignified exits. And here is the most striking, key detail about the assassination of Commodus. Absolutely nobody in Rome was surprised. The rumors had been there for years. The dark suspicions had been steadily growing, echoing in every corner of the capital. The idea that Commodus would eventually be violently removed wasn't shocking to anyone. It was viewed as a cold inevitability, which makes this one of the clearest, most undeniable examples in all of Roman history where the conspiracy theory wasn't wild speculation, it was a countdown. Everyone in the city knew exactly how it would end. They just didn't know exactly when, right up until the moment it finally happened and the breath left his lungs. By this point in history, Roman politics had already developed a terrifying reputation for being unstable, highly competitive, and occasionally fatal. But what happened next, immediately after the death of Commodus, pushed things into a completely different, almost surreal category. Because the next great conspiracy theory wasn't about whispers in the dark or silent poisonings. It was about something so deeply absurd, so completely outrageous, that people at the time could barely bring themselves to believe it was real. The entire Roman Empire was put up for sale. And this was not meant metaphorically. It was a literal public auction. After Commodus was assassinated, a well-respected man named Pertinax briefly became emperor. He bravely attempted to restore discipline to the military, reform the corrupted financial system, and generally act like a responsible traditional ruler. This noble effort lasted for exactly 3 months, because the Praetorian Guard, the elite, heavily armed soldiers specifically responsible for protecting the emperor, had very different financial priorities. They mutinied, stormed the palace, and killed him. And then, instead of carefully selecting a new, capable ruler to guide the state through the crisis, they dragged the throne to the highest bidder.
Yes, an auction. The most powerful, revered position in the known world, the absolute pinnacle of human authority, was casually offered to whoever could pay the highest price. 2 main bidders emerged from the terrified, bewildered elite of Rome. One of them was a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, who stood outside the heavily fortified camp of the Praetorian Guard and literally shouted his bids over the imposing stone walls. He promised the soldiers a massive, unprecedented payment in solid gold and silver. He won, because apparently, on that incredibly dark day in history, that is exactly how imperial succession functioned. Now imagine for a moment being an ordinary Roman citizen, waking up and walking through the bustling, sunlit markets, only to hear this news whispered among the stalls. The empire, your empire, the grand civilization that had conquered the Mediterranean and built roads across continents, had just been sold like a piece of used property. At the time, people didn't quite process it as reality. It sounded like a bitter rumor, a dark joke told in a tavern, a gross exaggeration of military greed. Surely this couldn't be how the ultimate power in the world actually changed hands. Except it was. Didius Julianus was declared emperor. He was recognized officially, legally, and technically by a terrified Senate, but not convincingly. Because buying power with gold and holding power with respect are 2 very, very different things.
the rest of the vast empire, especially the hardened, battle-tested legions stationed on the distant frontiers, were not particularly impressed with this crude financial transaction. Several powerful military leaders immediately rejected his bought and paid-for rule. And just like that, the empire plunged headfirst into another brutal round of civil war, which tends to happen when leadership is determined not by merit, blood, or law, but by a bidding war. The key point here is breathtakingly simple, yet profound. The idea that Rome had become so deeply corrupt, so fundamentally unstable, that even the grand imperial throne itself could be bought with a bag of coins was not a wild conspiracy theory. It was a historical event. It actually happened. And it demonstrated something very clearly to anyone paying attention. By this late stage, the Roman political system wasn't just vulnerable to conspiracies, it had become one. And once a system rots to that level, things rarely improve quietly. By the time the Emperor Caracalla came to power some years later, the city of Rome had already seen its fair share of dark conspiracies, midnight assassinations, and unexpected deaths that everyone quietly expected. So, when heavy rumors started circulating about a deep, simmering tension between him and his younger brother, people immediately paid attention. Because in the unforgiving halls of Rome, family disagreements had a very bad habit of becoming incredibly permanent. Caracalla and his brother, Geta, were supposed to rule the vast empire together as equals. In theory, this sounds like a perfectly balanced, harmonious arrangement: shared power, mutual respect, brotherly cooperation for the good of the state. In reality, it was the absolute political equivalent of locking two bitter, lifelong rivals in the same small room and asking them to share everything perfectly. Historical sources from the time describe the two young men as deeply, fundamentally incompatible. They argued constantly over every minor detail of governance. They avoided each other in the sprawling corridors of the imperial palaces, surrounding themselves with their own loyal guards. They reportedly even seriously considered dividing the entire Roman Empire in half, drawing a massive line across the map just to completely avoid any further interaction with one another. This is, to put it mildly, not a great sign for the stability of co-rulers. The imperial court quickly split into two dangerous factions. Some senators and generals supported Caracalla, while others quietly aligned with Geta. The tension in the air grew so thick you could almost feel it brushing against your skin. Rumors spread like a fever. There were constant dark whispers that one of them would eventually try to violently remove the other from the picture entirely. At the time, these whispers might have sounded overly dramatic to those who still believed in the sanctity of family. After all, they were brothers. They shared the same blood, the same imperial parents. Surely there were natural limits to their hatred. There were not. The breaking point finally came during what was officially supposed to be a calm reconciliation meeting, a peaceful, private discussion arranged by their mother, a chance to resolve their differences and heal the fractured court, which, in ancient Roman political terms, is almost always the exact moment when things go horribly, violently wrong. Geta arrived at the meeting with minimal protection, likely expecting at least the appearance of safety in his mother's presence. Instead, Caracalla had secretly arranged for armed soldiers to be waiting in the shadows. The meeting did not last long. Geta was attacked without warning and brutally killed right in front of their mother, a horrifying act that adds a level of sheer emotional discomfort that Roman history somehow always manages to normalize. Afterward, Caracalla didn't just physically remove his brother from the throne, he attempted to completely erase him from existence itself. Geta's name was aggressively chiseled out of stone monuments and struck from official records. His images and statues were systematically destroyed. His memory was officially condemned by the state, which is the ancient Roman version of deleting someone permanently from history. But here is the most important lingering detail of the entire tragic affair. The rumors of violence had been there all along. The people of Rome deeply suspected the tension would eventually end in blood. They fully expected betrayal, and they were completely right. This wasn't a shocking twist in the story of the empire. It was the exact outcome everyone had quietly, dreadfully predicted. Because in a political system where ultimate power fundamentally cannot be shared, eventually someone stops pretending. And in the cold reality of Rome, that decisive moment was rarely subtle and almost never peaceful.
By the time a teenage boy named Elagabalus took the ultimate power of the empire, Rome had already seen its fair share of unusual, terrifying, and eccentric rulers. The citizens were accustomed to violence and corruption, yet even by their incredibly flexible standards, this new emperor stood entirely apart. From the very beginning of his brief, chaotic reign, the most bizarre rumors surrounded him. These were wild stories filled with whispered accounts of strange foreign rituals, shocking personal behavior, a complete, absolute disregard for ancient Roman tradition, and a level of deep unpredictability that made even the most experienced, cynical Roman elites profoundly uncomfortable in their own city. At first, many in the Senate and the streets naturally assumed these stories were wildly exaggerated. After all, Roman historians had a well-documented habit of turning emperors they simply disliked into dramatic, theatrical, cautionary tales. Surely, the citizens reasoned, it couldn't all be entirely true. Surely, some of the most scandalous details were merely embellished by his political enemies. But the unsettling truth was, it was not as much of an exaggeration as people desperately hoped. Elagabalus came from the distant, sun-baked eastern provinces of the empire, specifically from Syria, and he was deeply, fanatically devoted to a foreign sun god known as Elagal. When he arrived in Rome and officially became emperor, he did not quietly adapt to the austere, stoic traditions of his new capital. Instead, he actively tried to replace them. He brazenly elevated his eastern sun god far above Jupiter, Rome's ancient chief deity, and ambitiously attempted to center the entirety of Roman religion around this new alien worship. In a city built on centuries of rigid tradition, where the approval of the old gods was believed to be the only thing keeping the empire from collapsing, this was not just an unpopular move, it was deeply terrifying. But his sweeping changes did not stop at theology. Ancient sources describe an imperial court that had transformed into a sensory overload designed to provoke confusion and outrage among the traditionalists. There were tales of incredibly lavish, suffocatingly extravagant banquets where exotic animals walked among the guests and where the air was thick with heavy incense and unusual ceremonies. He made unexpected, baffling political decisions that completely ignored established norms, elevating dancers and charioteers to high government offices simply because he favored them. At the time, many ordinary Romans tried to believe these stories were politically motivated slander, because it is always easier to assume exaggeration than to accept that your absolute ruler is genuinely, profoundly detached from reality. However, modern historians, while naturally cautious with ancient gossip, generally agree on one fundamental point. Elagabalus was indeed spectacularly unconventional.
Perhaps not every single outrageous story passed down through the centuries is entirely accurate in its finest details, but enough of them perfectly align to suggest that the overall, chaotic picture is not entirely fictional. Which means the reigning conspiracy theory of the day, that Rome was being ruled by someone completely, hopelessly detached from its traditions, expectations, and reality, was not really a theory at all. It was a lived situation. And like almost all extreme situations in Roman politics, it did not resolve itself peacefully or quietly. Eventually, the members of the Praetorian Guard, the very same elite group of soldiers that had already repeatedly demonstrated a highly flexible sense of loyalty, simply turned against him. Elagabalus was brutally assassinated in the latrines of his own camp, his body reportedly dragged through the streets and discarded into the dark, flowing waters of the Tiber River. His memory was officially condemned, which by now was becoming a depressingly familiar pattern, because Rome, as a society, could tolerate many things: vast corruption, sudden violence, shifting alliances, and endless conspiracies. But absolute unpredictability? That made people nervous. And when people with swords in Rome became nervous, history tended to violently repeat itself. If you had stopped a patrician in the street and asked whether the grand, honorable Roman Senate was ever involved in these endless conspiracies, the answer would likely be very simple and very brief: yes. Not always loudly, not always successfully, but consistently, generation after generation. Because the Roman Senate was not just a serene, passive governing body filled with wise elders debating philosophy. It was a massive collection of wealthy, powerful, incredibly ambitious individuals, all constantly trying to maintain and expand their own influence in a political system that constantly, relentlessly shifted beneath their feet. And when true influence and survival are at stake, cooperation among powerful men tends to become temporary, very, very temporary. Throughout the long, bloody history of the empire, emperors frequently suspected the Senate of plotting against them in the shadows of the Curia. And for a long time, later historians debated whether those imperial suspicions were simply the product of isolated paranoia. Were these emperors just seeing threats in the dark where none actually existed? Or was something much more organized going on behind the marble columns? The uncomfortable historical answer is both. Because while some emperors, like Tiberius or Nero, absolutely overreacted to the whispers around them, the Senate did, in fact, engage in deadly conspiracies regularly. They plotted against emperors, they plotted against their own political rivals, and they plotted against absolutely anyone who became too powerful, too wealthy, too unpredictable, or simply too dangerous to ignore. The Senate carried a long, proud, and often highly romanticized tradition of defending the noble idea of the ancient republic, even centuries after the republic had effectively permanently ended. This lingering historical memory meant that many senators quietly, deeply resented imperial authority. They hated bowing to one man. They couldn't openly oppose the emperor with an army. That would be incredibly unhealthy and usually led to a swift execution. But they could influence the court, undermine policies, spread devastating rumors, and occasionally, when the time was perfectly right, attempt to remove the emperor entirely. Some of these senatorial conspiracies were brilliantly successful, altering the course of the empire in a single night. Others failed miserably, ending in blood and mass executions. Many were discovered by imperial spies before they could fully develop past hushed conversations at a dinner party. But the underlying pattern remained an unshakable constant. Plotting in Rome was not unusual. It was the expected norm. And this created a deeply strange, exhausting dynamic at the very heart of the ancient world.
The emperors inherently didn't trust the Senate inherently didn't trust the emperor, and tragically, both sides were often completely, undeniably correct in their suspicions.
By now, one thing should feel very clear about the ancient world we just left behind. In ancient Rome, suspicion wasn't irrational, it was highly practical. If you lived in a system where emperors were assassinated, heirs died unexpectedly, advisors quietly accumulated power, and entire governments could be violently influenced behind closed doors, you didn't need a vivid imagination to be afraid. You simply needed basic awareness, because the line between a wild rumor and a deadly reality was paper thin. Take any moment we've looked at, the warnings before Julius Caesar was killed, the slow, methodical rise of Augustus, the quiet, deadly influence of Livia Drusilla, the growing power of Sejanus, or the chaotic actions of Nero. At the time, these monumental events were surrounded by whispers, suspicions, and theories. People were constantly connecting dots that didn't quite form a complete picture yet. And in many cases, those dots eventually connected, not because people were guessing wildly in the dark, but because they inherently understood the brutal system they were living in, a system where absolute power was fundamentally unstable, where loyalty shifted with the wind, and where survival often depended entirely on acting decisively before someone else did. So when something felt off in Rome, it usually was. This created a deeply strange, exhausting kind of environment, one where trusting too much is a fatal flaw, but distrusting everything is completely exhausting. Most people simply lived somewhere in the anxious middle, watching, listening, and trying desperately to figure out which rumors were just harmless stories and which ones were imminent warnings. Because sometimes a conspiracy theory is just a story told to pass the time, but sometimes it is the early, unwritten version of history. And ancient Rome gives us a perfect, chilling example of that. A world where the most unbelievable, outrageous ideas were often the most accurate, which in its own way makes Roman history feel less like the distant past and more like a very long, very dark lesson in how absolute power actually works.
But as the centuries passed and the great Roman Empire slowly fractured and faded into memory, the nature of fear itself began to change. We leave behind the sun-baked marble forums, the poisoned wine cups, and the Praetorian guards, and we travel forward in time and far to the north. We arrive in a place where the danger was no longer just the ambitious politician sitting across the table. The danger was in the very air itself. In Tudor England, the boundary between the living and the dead was not a heavy, sealed iron door. It was more like a thin, drafty curtain that never quite stayed completely still. People did not simply believe in ghosts as abstract concepts or campfire tales. They lived with the quiet, unsettling assumption that the dead were still lingering nearby, watching from the corners of the room, listening to whispered conversations, and occasionally making their unseen presence known in the most inconvenient, chilling ways possible. A sudden biting chill in an otherwise warm room was not dismissed as a mere draft from a poorly fitted window. A shadow that lingered just a fraction of a second too long in the flickering candlelight was not ignored as a simple trick of the eye. These were signs. And ignoring signs in the complex, highly superstitious logic of Tudor England was considered a terrible, dangerous idea. This deep-seated mindset did not come from a collective, overactive imagination alone. It was deeply, inextricably rooted in religion,
which during the Tudor period was going through what could generously be described as a massive, violent identity crisis. Under the sweeping, world-altering reign of King Henry VIII, England dramatically broke away from the ancient authority of the Catholic Church. And with that massive political and spiritual shift came a dramatic, unsettling change in how ordinary people were supposed to understand the afterlife. The comforting, long-held Catholic idea of purgatory, a sort of spiritual waiting room where souls could be temporarily purified before entering heaven, was aggressively swept aside by the new Protestant reformers. According to this strict new view, souls did not linger in a middle ground. The moment breath left the body, they went straight, immediately, to heaven or hell. There was no wandering. And yet, despite what the new laws and the fierce preachers declared from the pulpits, the people still felt them. This glaring contradiction created a strange, quiet tension across the country. Officially, by royal decree, ghosts were not supposed to exist anymore. Unofficially, in the damp, quiet hours of the night, everyone still heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing in empty halls. Exhausted servants whispered to one another about pale figures seen standing silently at the foot of beds. Weary travelers entirely avoided certain winding roads at night, not because they were unsafe due to thieves or outlaws, but because it was widely known that something unseen, something restless, walked those very same roads long after the sun had set. So, because the experiences continued but the old explanations were outlawed, the explanations had to evolve. If a spirit appeared in a darkened corridor, it could not be a wandering, sorrowful soul from purgatory asking for prayers anymore. That would directly contradict the new religious order of the king. Instead, it was often labeled something far more sinister, far more unsettling, a demon in disguise. It was believed to be something purely malevolent pretending to be the dead, sent straight from the depths of hell to mislead, terrorize, and damn the living. Which, if anything, made the entire situation infinitely worse. Because now, every unexplained sound in an old house was not just a sad, lost ghost of a grandfather. It might be something far darker, something actively, intelligently trying to deceive and destroy you. Sleep became an uneasy endeavor. Nighttime became inherently suspicious. And the ordinary daylight world, once filled with predictable, comforting routines, now felt densely layered with invisible, supernatural dangers. In Tudor England, fear was not loud or dramatic like a Roman assassination. It was quiet. It crept slowly into daily life, sat silently beside you in the shifting candlelight, and followed you closely down long, drafty corridors when absolutely no one else was there. And once you accepted the terrifying premise that the dead might still be watching, it became very, very difficult to ever feel truly alone again.
If you lived in Tudor England, death rarely arrived completely unannounced, or at least that is what the people fervently believed. The world around them was not just a physical space of timber, stone, and soil. It was a vast living tapestry woven with signs, subtle warnings, and deeply unsettling clues that something was about to go terribly wrong. And once you learned the language of these omens, once you started noticing them in the shadowy corners of your daily life, it became absolutely impossible to stop. You couldn't simply unsee the warnings. The universe was constantly communicating, and the messages were almost always grim. One of the most universally feared omens was the sudden, inexplicable appearance of animals behaving incorrectly. The natural world was supposed to follow a divine, predictable order, so any deviation from that order was a glaring red flag.
A dog howling at nothing in the dead of the night was not just a noisy, frustrating inconvenience that kept a tired village awake. In the Tudor mind, the dog was not howling at nothing. It was said to be actively sensing spirits lingering nearby in the dark, often a chilling, surefire sign that someone in the immediate household or the surrounding neighborhood would soon die. Imagine lying in a heavy wooden bed, the room pitch black, listening to that long, mournful sound echoing through the narrow, cobbled streets, wondering exactly whose door the unseen visitor was pausing before. Cats, too, were treated with a heavy, persistent dose of suspicion, especially if they stared just a little too long into completely empty corners of a room. Unfortunately, as anyone who has ever lived with one knows, cats tend to do exactly this anyway. But in a superstitious Tudor household, a cat fixated on a shadow wasn't just tracking a hidden mouse, it was watching something step across the boundary between worlds. Birds, however, were perhaps considered even worse messengers. A lone raven lazily circling above a thatched roof against a gray, overcast sky could easily send an entire family into a state of quiet, profound panic. Owls hooting near a bedroom window at night were certainly not viewed as charming, wise woodland creatures. They were widely known as the grim messengers of death, their calls in the darkness announcing that someone inside the home might not live to see another sunrise. And if a bird made the fatal mistake of flying directly into a window pane, striking the glass with a sudden, violent thud, that was considered less of a tragic natural accident and much more of a very blunt, undeniable physical warning from whatever unseen forces governed the fragile thread of human life.
But the terrifying signs from the animal kingdom were only one part of this complex web of superstition. The human body itself could suddenly betray signs of approaching doom. A sudden, sharp ringing in the ears when the room was otherwise perfectly silent. A violent, unexpected shiver that ran down the spine on a warm summer day, or an overwhelming, unexplained feeling of cold dread settling heavy in the stomach. All of these physical sensations were taken incredibly seriously. Even something as small and seemingly mundane as a candle suddenly extinguishing itself without any reason, without a single draft in the unventilated room, could instantly turn a calm, quiet evening by the glowing hearth into a tense, suffocating silence. Because if the comforting light could just disappear that easily, snuffed out by an invisible breath, what else might follow in the pitch black? Then there were the dreams. In this deeply superstitious era, dreams were never just meaningless random images conjured by an exhausted, sleeping mind. They were direct messages, terrifying visions that pierced the veil between the living and the dead. Seeing a recently deceased person in your sleep was often interpreted as a literal visitation, and it was rarely considered a friendly or comforting one. If the dead spoke in these dreams, people listened with terrifying attention, memorizing every single word, sometimes waking up in a cold sweat with a racing heart and a profound sense of urgency they couldn't fully explain to anyone else. Sleep, the one place that should have offered sanctuary from the heavy burdens of Tudor life, was just another dark landscape where the unseen world could reach out and touch you. Mirrors, too, carried their own specific deep-seated dangers. Glass was expensive, mysterious, and highly reflective, qualities that made it perfectly suited for dark superstitions. If someone died in a house, it was an immediate, strict custom to cover every mirror with a heavy cloth.
The pressing fear was that a wandering soul, confused, disoriented, and newly separated from its physical body, might accidentally look into the glass and become trapped inside the reflection, lingering there indefinitely. Which inevitably raises a deeply uncomfortable question for anyone living in that era. As you pass by a mirror in an old, ancient manor house, how many unseen reflections are already occupying the silvered glass, quietly watching you walk by? Of course, logic dictates that not every single omen led to death. A candle blows out, a dog howls at the moon, and yet the sun still rises the next morning, and the family remains whole. But that lingering, persistent uncertainty was exactly what made these superstitions so incredibly powerful and resilient across generations. You could never be absolutely sure which sign was a harmless coincidence and which one was quietly, definitively announcing the final chapter of someone's story. So the people watched. They listened carefully to the wind howling through the chimneys. They observed the animals in the fields. They interpreted absolutely everything around them. This constant state of observation created a unique, exhausting rhythm to Tudor life. It was a life lived on the very edge of anticipation. The rustle of dry leaves in the courtyard, the creak of an old oak floorboard under the weight of an invisible step, the sudden drop in temperature in the stone cellar. Every sensory detail was instantly catalogued and analyzed. Because in a Tudor world where death constantly left subtle clues behind, ignoring those clues felt far more reckless and dangerous than simply believing in them.
If the everyday omens of Tudor life whispered that death was near, the great castles and manor houses of England were where those chilling warnings seemed to settle, sink deep into the stone, and stay permanently. The sprawling landscape of Tudor England was dotted with massive, grand stone residences. They were visually impressive, monumentally cold, and, according to almost everyone who lived and worked within their heavy walls, already occupied by far more than just the living. These were not simply comfortable family homes built for warmth and safety. They were physical manifestations of raw power, history, and survival. And by their very architectural nature, castles were the absolute perfect settings for ghost stories to thrive and multiply. Imagine standing in the center of one of these ancient fortresses as the sun begins to set. The thick, unyielding stone walls trapped sound in incredibly strange, distorted ways. A door closing heavily in the west wing might echo through the main hall like a muffled clap of thunder, while a conversation spoken in normal tones just around a corner might sound like a chorus of distant, disembodied whispers. Long, narrow corridors stretched endlessly into the suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the weak, flickering light of widely spaced torches. Steep, spiraling staircases turned sharply and unpredictably into the gloom, often hiding far more than they revealed to the person slowly ascending them. And at night, when the grand fires in the hearths burned low to glowing red embers, and the exhausted servants moved quietly through the deeply shadowed halls, every single small noise seemed to carry a heavy, deliberate meaning. But the real underlying reason these castles were universally considered to be profoundly haunted was far less architectural and far more human. These grand structures were places of immense, ruthless ambition, catastrophic betrayal, and very often sudden, extreme violence. The grand halls where royal banquets were held, filled with music and laughter, were often just floors above the damp, windowless dungeons.
Political plots that shaped the future of the entire nation unfolded quietly behind thick, closed oak doors. Prisoners of state were securely held, ruthlessly interrogated, and sometimes formally executed within the very same walls where the nobility slept. And in the deeply held belief system of the Tudor era, when death came suddenly, and especially when it came unjustly or through violent betrayal, it was universally believed that the soul of the victim did not move on easily. It anchored itself to the location of its suffering.
This belief gave rise to one of the most enduring, terrifying types of supernatural entities in English history, the restless spirit. Unlike a peaceful, ordinary soul which might quietly depart the physical world to face divine judgment, a restless spirit lingered in the heavy air of the castle because something fundamental was left tragically unresolved. It could be a horrific betrayal that went entirely unpunished by the courts. It could be a dark family secret left unrevealed before the grave. Or, in some of the most famous cases, it was a rather inconvenient, politically motivated murder that absolutely no one in the royal court wanted to acknowledge publicly. These souls were trapped, condemned to pace the same stone floors, replaying their final desperate moments in a continuous, silent loop that only the living could occasionally, terrifyingly interrupt. The servants of these grand estates were almost always the very first to report these chilling encounters. Because they were the ones who truly kept the castle alive, they were the ones walking the long, freezing corridors long after the nobility had safely retired behind locked doors. They were the ones tasked with waking up in the pitch-black hours of the early morning to light the fires and prepare the kitchens. They spoke in hushed, terrified voices of heavy footsteps echoing clearly through entirely empty corridors. They swore they saw heavy, iron-bound doors opening slowly, groaning on their hinges without any visible hand pushing them. They vividly described sudden freezing drafts of air that seemed to deliberately follow a person from room to room down a hallway, carrying the distinct, unsettling sensation that something unseen had taken a very specific, personal interest in them. And then, beyond the sounds and the cold, there were the actual physical sightings. These were not just vague shapes in the dark. Servants and guards described seeing solid figures dressed in highly detailed but completely outdated clothing, sometimes heavy, rusted armor from a century past, sometimes elaborate, torn, courtly garments of velvet and silk. These figures would appear briefly, silently, at the end of a long hallway or standing completely still in the corner of a grand bedroom before vanishing entirely into the stonework. Their faces were always described as remarkably pale, their expressions entirely unreadable, as if they were caught forever in a painful space between remembering their past and forgetting exactly why they still remained in the castle. Of course, not everyone in Tudor society openly admitted to believing these terrifying stories. The high nobility, the lords and ladies who owned these massive fortresses in particular, fiercely preferred to maintain a rigid sense of control, logic, and rationality. After all, it is incredibly difficult to project divine authority and absolute power over a region when your own castle might currently be hosting uninvited supernatural guests from the afterlife. To admit fear was to admit a lack of control. But in the quiet, private moments of the night, even the most powerful lords were not entirely immune to the creeping, suffocating unease. Because in a massive, echoing place filled with centuries of violent history, where absolutely every cold stone block had witnessed something terrible, a whispered conspiracy of treason, a desperate
tearful plea for mercy, a final bloody breath. The idea that some small, tragic part of that history might physically linger did not feel entirely unreasonable. And so, despite their outward projections of bravery and power, the nobility made quiet concessions to the dark. The expensive wax candles in their bedchambers stayed lit a little longer into the night. The heavy wooden doors were bolted closed a little more carefully by the guards, and absolutely no one, no matter their high rank, their wealth, or their immense power, walked those dark, historic castle corridors at night without listening just a little bit more closely than they ever cared to admit.
If the pale ghosts wandering the drafty corridors of grand castles represented the heavy, restless past, then curses and the dark art of witchcraft embodied something far more terrifying, a present, immediate threat that could reach directly into your life at any moment, quietly and completely without warning. In the harsh, unpredictable reality of Tudor England, misfortune was rarely, if ever, seen as purely random. A sudden, devastating illness that took a perfectly healthy child in the middle of the night, a widespread blight that ruined a crucial summer harvest, or a valuable herd of cattle suddenly falling ill and dying. These were not simply viewed as tragic, unfortunate events dictated by the cold laws of nature. They were highly suspicious. They were interpreted almost universally across all classes of society as the direct result of someone, somewhere, actively doing something deeply unnatural. And that someone was almost always branded a witch. The pervasive idea of witchcraft was not some fringe, abstract theory debated only by high-minded theologians in distant universities. It was woven tightly into the very fabric of everyday Tudor thinking. It was deeply personal and incredibly local. A bitter neighbor who argued just a little too often over a shared property line, an old, impoverished woman who lived entirely alone at the dark edge of the village woods, or someone who simply knew a bit too much about wild herbs and potent natural remedies. Any of these individuals could quickly, almost overnight, fall under the crushing, suffocating weight of public suspicion. It did not take much to ignite the dangerous fires of paranoia. A single heated disagreement over a borrowed tool, followed closely by a sudden streak of unexplainable bad luck, could easily be enough to convince an entire terrified village that something much darker than mere coincidence was actively at work. Curses, in particular, were deeply and profoundly feared. The Tudor mind genuinely believed that words carried immense, tangible physical power. A softly spoken word of malice, a dark muttered phrase under the breath as an angry neighbor walked away, or even a cold, unblinking glance held for just a fraction of a second too long, these could all be interpreted as deliberate acts of spiritual harm. Ordinary people firmly believed that witches possessed the terrifying, unnatural ability to manipulate the world around them to cause immense suffering. They could cause fresh milk to sour instantly in the wooden pail, valuable farm animals to become barren, or infants to develop strange, lingering fevers without any visible, logical cause. And because the origins of these malicious effects were entirely invisible, they were far more terrifying than a physical attack by a thief on the road. You could not easily draw a sword to defend yourself against a weapon you could not even see. Naturally, despite the absolute impossibility of fighting the invisible, the people desperately tried to protect themselves anyway.
Protective, superstitious measures became an essential, unthinking part of daily Tudor life. Small, crude charms were secretly carried in pockets or carefully hidden in the dark corners of modest homes. Certain strong-smelling herbs like rosemary, sage, or witch hazel were widely believed to ward off evil intent. They were hung in dried bundles near heavy oak doorways or burned slowly in the evening fires to spiritually cleanse the air of the room. Prayers were repeated constantly throughout the day, not just out of pure, pious religious devotion, but as a kind of heavy, spiritual shield erected against unseen, malevolent forces constantly pressing in from the dark. Even the very way a traditional Tudor house was constructed could deeply reflect these pervasive, everyday fears. Builders and anxious homeowners would deliberately carve hidden protective marks, often called witch marks or apotropaic marks, into the heavy wooden ceiling beams or the stone borders of the fireplaces. These overlapping circles, intricate webs, and strange geometric symbols were explicitly meant to confuse, trap, or repel malevolent spirits before they could ever cross the threshold into the living space. Sometimes, old, worn-out shoes or personal items of clothing were deliberately sealed inside the walls or buried deep under the floorboards during construction. These items were meant to act as spiritual decoys, absorbing any dark magic or curses and drawing the evil away from the vulnerable living inhabitants of the house. But fear, as it so often does in human history, eventually led to direct, violent accusation. When something went terribly wrong in a close-knit community, and in an era without modern medicine or reliable agriculture, many things often did, someone ultimately had to be blamed. The heavy burden of collective grief and unexplained loss demanded a human scapegoat. Formal trials for witchcraft began to appear more frequently across the countryside, creating a terrifying legal environment where mere suspicion, long-standing grudges, and local gossip alone could carry incredibly dangerous, fatal weight. Concrete physical evidence was rarely clear, and in most courts it did not even need to be. A long-term pattern of local misfortune, combined with a person's unfortunate reputation for being slightly different or difficult, was often more than enough to turn quiet village whispers into formal, deadly charges that ended at the gallows. And yet, despite the genuine, widespread terror of the witch trials, there was a remarkably strange, lingering contradiction at the very heart of Tudor society. The exact same society that so deeply feared the malicious power of witches also relied heavily, and somewhat hypocritically, on various forms of traditional folk magic. When the expensive, educated physicians failed, or when their services were simply entirely unaffordable for the common people, desperate families actively sought out local healers, cunning folk, and wise women for help. They gladly paid these individuals for herbal remedies, protective amulets, and spoken charms to cure illnesses or locate lost property, even as others in the very same county were being condemned to death for practicing similar arts. This profound contradiction meant that the delicate line between helpful, necessary magic and harmful, demonic witchcraft was not always clear. It was a blurry, constantly shifting boundary, defined mostly by intent, consequence, and local popularity. In Tudor England, the unseen world was not a distant, abstract concept to be debated only by scholars. It was intimately personal. It lived right there, just beyond sight, deeply shaped by religious belief, overwhelming fear, and the quiet, persistent suspicion that sometimes terrible misfortune did not just happen on its own, it was deliberately, maliciously summoned. In Tudor England, however,
Not all terrifying signs and omens came from the restless spirits of the dead or the whispered curses of local witches. Some warnings were believed to come from a far higher, infinitely more powerful authority, or at least that is exactly what the people of the era were conditioned to believe. The natural world itself was thought to be a kind of massive, ongoing divine message, constantly speaking to humanity through strange environmental events, unusual weather patterns, and highly specific moments that felt just a little too deliberate, a little too perfectly timed to be dismissed as mere coincidence. These were absolutely never viewed as random accidents of nature. They were universally understood as direct signs from God, and ignoring them was not just considered foolish, it was considered incredibly dangerous and spiritually unwise. Storms, for example, were rarely just passing storms to the Tudor mind. A sudden, violent thunderstorm that rolled across the darkened English countryside, shaking the very foundations of the timber-framed houses, could easily be interpreted as an expression of pure divine anger. It was a loud, booming warning from the heavens that something, somewhere within the community, had gone deeply, morally wrong. Lightning violently striking a tall building, especially a church spire or a prominent manor house, was not just an unfortunate random discharge of atmospheric electricity. It was viewed as highly specific, targeted, almost as if heaven itself had made a final, decisive judgment against the inhabitants of that particular structure. But even a terrifying thunderstorm paled in comparison to the dread inspired by the night sky. Comets were perhaps even worse. When a comet unexpectedly appeared, burning its way across the velvet blackness of the sky, it brought with it a quiet, paralyzing wave of widespread dread across the entire nation. These strange, glowing streaks, with their long, pale tails, were universally seen as undeniable omens of massive, catastrophic change. They were almost always tied by astrologers and commoners alike to the impending death of a reigning ruler, the sudden outbreak of a bloody, devastating war, or a coming natural disaster like a plague or famine. People did not look up at them with a sense of scientific curiosity or astronomical wonder. They looked up with a deep, sinking concern, wondering what exact terrible sequence of events had just been set into motion by the hand of the Almighty. Even incredibly small, seemingly insignificant everyday events within the home could carry immense, terrifying weight. A simple loaf of bread burning unexpectedly in the oven, despite careful watching. A valuable glass or pottery vessel shattering loudly without any visible cause, or a sudden, sharp illness striking down an otherwise perfectly healthy person in the prime of their life. All of these occurrences could be interpreted as divine signals. They were not random, and they were not meaningless. They were deliberate nudges meant to be noticed, analyzed, and deeply understood. Of course, understanding exactly what these signs meant was the truly difficult, exhausting part of Tudor life. The local clergy often stepped in to interpret these strange events, offering long explanations from the pulpit that conveniently aligned with current religious teachings and political realities. But interpretations naturally varied wildly. One specific event could mean entirely different things to different people, depending on their own personal fears, their hidden hopes, or their current financial situation. This meant that absolute certainty was always just out of reach, hovering like a ghost. And yet the people continued to search desperately for meaning in absolutely everything. Because in a world where God might be communicating directly through the smallest, most mundane detail, absolutely nothing felt insignificant. Every unusual moment carried a heavy weight. Every minor disruption in the daily routine hinted at something much larger, something incredibly powerful hidden just beneath the thin surface of daily life. This constant, unrelenting awareness created a quiet, pervasive tension. Life was not just simply lived, it was constantly observed, rigorously analyzed, and continuously interpreted. People watched the skies with anxious eyes, listened closely to the shifting wind, and paid deep attention to the smallest irregularities in their homes, just in case they were being told something vitally important. But if daytime in Tudor England was filled with signs and suspicions, nighttime was something else entirely. When the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon and the last warm light faded behind the jagged, timbered rooftops, the world did not simply grow darker, it became profoundly uncertain. Familiar, comforting places instantly shifted their shapes. Safe spaces felt significantly less reliable, and whatever entities people believed might exist just beyond their sight suddenly felt much, much closer. Night was the specific time when the strict boundaries of the world weakened. Without the brilliant, illuminating glow of artificial light that we enjoy today, Tudor darkness was nearly absolute. A single flickering tallow candle could only illuminate a very small, fragile circle of light, leaving absolutely everything beyond its weak reach swallowed entirely in thick, impenetrable shadow. And in those deep shadows, the human imagination did not need much encouragement to run wild. A heavy wool coat hanging innocently by a wooden door instantly became a towering, silent figure. A rough beam of wood stretched across the low ceiling took on unfamiliar, menacing shapes. And every single sound, every creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle of the wind, every unidentifiable movement seemed significantly louder, closer, and far more deliberate. People actively avoided being outside after dark whenever it was physically possible. This was not just because of the very real threat of common thieves or physical danger in the ordinary sense, but because the night belonged to something else entirely. Spirits were thought to move much more freely when the sun was gone. Witches, it was widely whispered, worked their darkest, most potent magic under the heavy cover of darkness. And demons, if they existed at all in the physical realm, were highly unlikely to keep polite daytime hours. Even inside the heavy, locked doors of the home, the sense of safety was never complete. Beds were often shared for warmth, and small rooms were heavily crowded. Yet, despite the proximity of family, sleep did not always come easily. Waking suddenly in the dead middle of the night was a common and deeply unsettling experience. You might open your eyes to a room that looked almost familiar in the moonlight, but not quite. The shadows stretched in impossible directions. The quiet felt far too heavy, pressing down on your chest. And for a brief, terrifying moment, you might wonder, with a cold shiver down your spine, if you were truly alone in the dark.
By the time death finally arrived in the shadowed bedchambers of Tudor England, and in that era it rarely waited politely or announced itself with gentle grace, the people surrounding the sickbed were already meticulously prepared. They were not necessarily prepared emotionally for the profound grief of loss, but practically,
because death was not viewed merely as a quiet ending. It was deeply understood as a moment fraught with incredible spiritual risk. It was a highly dangerous transition where something supernatural could easily go wrong, where the fragile boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was suddenly at its thinnest, and where the living had an absolute, terrifying responsibility to manage exactly what happened next. The very moment someone drew their final breath and the chest stopped rising, the atmosphere in the household changed immediately and drastically. The first, most urgent act was almost always physical. Windows in the death chamber might be thrown wide open, regardless of the freezing rain or the biting winter wind howling outside. This was not a symbolic gesture of release, it was intensely practical. The living firmly believed they were allowing the newly untethered soul to leave the physical body and exit the room freely without obstruction. A trapped soul was not a peaceful soul, and absolutely no one in a Tudor household wanted a confused, disoriented spirit lingering in the rafters longer than necessary. Simultaneously, others in the room would rush to deal with the mirrors. Every reflective surface in the house, especially the expensive, polished glass mirrors of the wealthy, was quickly covered with heavy, dark cloth. The reasoning behind this was simple, though deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities. The fear was that a wandering spirit, freshly detached from its physical vessel and perhaps terrified of its new state, might accidentally catch its own reflection, become tragically confused, and get permanently trapped inside the cold silvered glass. And once a soul was trapped inside a mirror, there was no clear, universally agreed upon method in Tudor folklore to safely get it out again. Then the clocks were stopped. The heavy rhythmic ticking that usually measured out the days and nights of the household was suddenly silenced. Time itself seemed entirely inappropriate in the heavy presence of death, as if continuing to mechanically measure the passing hours might somehow disturb whatever sacred, mysterious process was unfolding in the room. The entire house entered a kind of breathless pause, a suspended animation where all normal daily routines were quietly, respectfully set aside. After these initial precautions came the long, exhausting reality of the body itself. It was absolutely never left alone in the dark. Watching over the dead, a practice we now casually call a wake, was an essential, deeply serious part of the dying process. Family members, close neighbors, and sometimes even passing acquaintances would gather in the dimly lit room, keeping a strict, continuous vigil through the long hours of the night. On the surface, to an outside observer, it appeared to be a beautiful act of respect and communal mourning, and indeed it was. But beneath the prayers and the quiet tears, it served another, far more anxious purpose, to ensure that nothing unexpected happened. Because in the candlelit gloom, there was always a lingering, unspoken concern that the dead might not remain entirely still. Dark stories circulated constantly in taverns and marketplaces of bodies that subtly shifted under their linen shrouds, of faint, unexplainable sounds heard in otherwise silent, sealed rooms. Whether these were real biological events or simply the terrifying product of exhausted, grieving minds trapped in flickering, shadowy spaces hardly mattered. The terrifying possibility alone was more than enough to justify constant, unblinking watchfulness. Protective objects were sometimes carefully placed near the body. Pungent herbs, small wooden tokens, were blessed religious items, all desperately meant to guide the soul safely away from the earth and strictly prevent anything demonic from interfering with its delicate journey. And yet, despite all these heavy precautions, a profound uncertainty always lingered in the air.
because no matter how carefully the rituals were followed, no one could say with complete confidence what actually happened in those unseen, silent moments between death and whatever eternity came after. In Tudor England, death was not just feared, it was managed carefully, cautiously, and with the quiet, terrifying understanding that if handled incorrectly, the dead might not stay neatly contained. And by this time, these kinds of ghost stories were not just anonymous whispers in small, isolated farming villages or vague fears shared among servants in the kitchens. Some of these lingering spirits had names, they had faces, they had specific places they haunted, and a few became so incredibly well known that their legends easily outlived the very people who first nervously told them. In Tudor England, certain royal hauntings gained a massive, unshakable reputation, the kind that made even the most cynical, rational nobleman pause slightly when walking past a particular shadowed doorway in the capital. Perhaps the most famous, the most enduring of all these aristocratic spirits was the tragic ghost of Queen Anne Boleyn. Executed on the cold scaffolding in 1536 by the command of her husband, King Henry VIII, her death was incredibly swift, deeply political, and by many historical accounts profoundly unjust, which, in the strict logic of Tudor ghost lore, made her the absolute ideal candidate for returning from the grave. Stories quickly claimed she was seen walking the fog-shrouded grounds of the Tower of London, sometimes pacing the stone corridors in her elegant gowns, and occasionally, in a detail that highlights the era's lack of subtlety, carrying her severed head silently beneath her arm. It is a dramatic, horrific image, yes, but Tudor ghosts were never known for being subtle. Terrified guards and witnesses described her phantom as remarkably calm, almost distant, as if she were still endlessly caught in the quiet, reflective final moments of her life before the executioner's sword fell. Whether these specific sightings were real or the product of collective guilt mattered less than the psychological effect they had. The Tower of London, already a grim place associated with cold imprisonment and bloody execution, gained an additional suffocating layer of unease. It was no longer just a stone historical site. It was actively, potentially still occupied by the victims of the crown. Then there was Catherine Howard, another young, tragic queen whose life ended abruptly and violently within those very same unforgiving stone walls. Her ghost, however, was said to appear not in calm, melancholy silence, but in a state of sheer frantic motion. Legends whispered that her spirit could be seen running, screaming in absolute terror down the long, empty corridors of Hampton Court Palace, endlessly reliving the desperate, agonizing moments when she broke free from her guards to beg the king for her life just before her execution. According to the chilling tales, she could be heard racing down the haunted gallery, her phantom cries echoing off the tapestries, as if trying unsuccessfully for all eternity to escape a terrible fate that had already been permanently sealed in blood.
Of course, not all hauntings in Tudor England were strictly royal, but the royal ones naturally tended to receive much better, far more enduring publicity. In grand, sprawling manor houses across the damp English countryside, wealthy families quietly passed down their own private stories of figures seen briefly at high leaded windows, of heavy, rhythmic footsteps heard in drawing rooms that had been locked and unused for decades, and of heavy oak doors opening just enough to suggest a deliberate, unseen intention. These spectral figures were not always tied to famous historical names or grand political tragedies, but they carried a very similar, undeniable weight.
a local history of bitter betrayal, sudden loss, or violent death often seem to leave behind something far more tangible than just a fading memory. Interestingly, as the generations passed, these chilling stories were not always told with pure, trembling fear. Over time, there developed a strange, almost comforting familiarity to them. A resident ghost could slowly become part of a noble household's very identity, a piece of living history to casually mention to guests, to mildly warn the new servants about, and perhaps eventually even to accept as a permanent fixture of the estate. The nobility would say, yes, that particular corridor in the West Wing is completely avoided at night, but only because of the usual reasons, which, if anything, makes the entire concept feel slightly more unsettling. Because when a ghost story becomes entirely normal, when it shifts seamlessly from a shocking, terrifying anomaly to an expected part of the evening routine, it suggests something much deeper about the society itself. It reveals not just a fear of the unknown, but a quiet, deeply ingrained acceptance that the past does not always stay exactly where it should. And in Tudor England, it rarely, if ever, did. By the end of it all, Tudor life was not defined by a single overwhelming belief in the supernatural, but by a constant, exhausting balancing act between profound fear and deep faith. The ghosts, the dire omens, the whispered curses, and the dramatic divine signs, none of these existed in total isolation. They wove together to form a quiet, ever-present background to everyday existence, subtly shaping decisions, influencing daily behavior, and lingering just beneath the surface of even the most ordinary sunlit moments. People still lived their lives. They worked the fields, they traded goods in bustling markets, they cooked hearty meals over open fires, they argued over politics, and they laughed with their children. Life did not simply stop because the night felt heavily watched or because a stray bird flew a little too close to a bed-chamber window. But absolutely everything they did carried an added, unspoken layer of awareness, a constant sense that the visible, physical world was only a very small part of the total story.
Faith, for the vast majority of the population, was the ultimate anchor in this sea of uncertainty. A spoken prayer was not just an empty ritual or a habit. It was a literal, physical shield of protection. The towering stone churches in the center of the villages were not just places of Sunday worship. They were sanctuary spaces where divine order could be fully restored, where the swirling chaos of unseen demonic forces could be momentarily pushed back by the ringing of the bells and the light of the altar. Even as the official religious beliefs of the nation violently shifted back and forth during the turbulent Tudor period, the fundamental human need for spiritual reassurance remained an absolute constant. At the exact same time, the fear never fully disappeared. It simply adapted. It settled deeply into their routines. The people of Tudor England learned exactly how to live alongside it, in much the same way one might learn to ignore a persistent, freezing draft in a very old house. You notice it. You adjust your chair away from it. You pull your wool cloak a little tighter, but you never quite forget it is there. A strange noise in the middle of the night might eventually be dismissed, but only after a brief, tense pause. A shadow stretching across the floorboards might be ignored, but never without a quick second glance. Children grew up absorbing these dark stories by the hearth, internalizing them as a fundamental part of their understanding of how the universe operated. By the time they reached adulthood, the idea that something unseen might be present in the room was not unusual. It was entirely expected. The fear was not always dramatic or loud. It was subtle, woven into small habits and daily precautions.
And yet, strangely enough, there was also a deep comfort to be found within it. Because if spirits genuinely existed, if the omens carried true meaning, if the world was filled to the brim with divine messages and unseen presences, then life was fundamentally not random. It was deeply connected, incredibly purposeful, and constantly watched over, even if that cosmic attention was not always particularly friendly. The exact same beliefs that caused them terror also offered a strange kind of reassurance that nothing happened without a reason. Of course, whether those divine reasons were truly understood by humanity was another matter entirely. In Tudor England, the people did not conquer their fears of the unseen. They simply learned to live intimately with them, to interpret the shadows, and to cautiously navigate a world where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were never entirely clear. And perhaps that is what defined the era most of all. Not the ghosts themselves, but the quiet, unshakable certainty that something might always be just out of sight, waiting patiently to be noticed. But while the people of Tudor England looked to the dark corners of their bedchambers and the stormy skies for their fears, centuries earlier, the most powerful men in the world looked straight down at their dinner plates. If we leave the damp, haunted castles of England and travel back through the centuries to the sun-drenched marble palaces of the ancient Roman Empire, we find a fear that was not spiritual, but intensely, intimately physical. Because in Rome, before an emperor took a single bite of his lavish meal, someone else already had. That someone was the pregustator, the official taste tester. This was a slave whose entire job description was brutally, terrifyingly simple. Eat first and actively hope nothing happens. Because if something did happen, that was the entire point of their existence. Poison was one of the most deeply feared, highly utilized weapons in all of ancient Rome. It was not loud like a gladiator's dagger. It was not chaotic like a battlefield, but it was quiet, practically invisible, and incredibly, lethally effective. A single beautifully prepared, contaminated dish could easily end an imperial life before anyone in the dining room even realized what had happened. And in a cutthroat world where absolute power meant 1,000 hidden enemies, and enemies meant constant waking paranoia, Roman emperors did not rely on the goodwill of the gods or pure luck. They relied on someone else's complete expendability.
Enter the pregustator. These individuals were not honored servants, decorated military veterans, or trusted political advisors who sat comfortably at the emperor's right hand. They were human shields in the absolute, most literal sense, placed deliberately and coldly between the most powerful man on earth and death itself. Every single opulent meal, every silver cup of spiced wine, every carefully prepared exotic delicacy of roasted meats, sweet honeyed figs, and rich sauces passed through their mouths first. They tasted absolutely everything. And then the entire room watched. Because the most important, agonizing part of their unique job description was not the tasting itself, it was the waiting. A few silent seconds, a long stretched-out minute, just long enough for the royal physicians and the emperor to see if anything went horribly physically wrong. If the taster remained alive, standing quietly and breathing normally, the emperor would finally proceed to eat. If not, well, the brutal system had worked exactly as intended. What makes this deeply unsettling practice even more remarkable is just how incredibly normal it became in Roman high society. This was not a desperate emergency measure used only in rare circumstances during times of open civil war. It was a daily,
unblinking routine. Daily life at the grand imperial court included the quiet, accepted understanding that someone might need to suffer and die in agony before dinner could safely begin. And yet, these individuals were not random, unfortunate victims selected from the dungeons moments before a meal. Many of them were permanent fixtures of the household. They lived with this reality every single day. Which raises a rather uncomfortable, profound question about the human mind. What does it truly feel like to wake up every single morning knowing with absolute certainty that your sole professional purpose is to potentially die before lunch? Because in the rigidly structured society of ancient Rome, survival was not evenly distributed. At the very top sat the emperor, surrounded by unimaginable luxury, guarded by heavy bronze doors and layers of armed protection. And at the very bottom, someone had to physically absorb the risk of his power. The pregustator was that person, not a celebrated hero, not a willing martyr for the state, just a necessary, breathing sacrifice in a political system where trust was considered inherently dangerous and absolute caution came at a human cost.
And once you truly understand that chilling dynamic, every lavish Roman banquet you read about starts to look a little different. That first delicate bite of food was never just about nourishment or culinary pleasure. It was about survival in a ruthless court where trusting the people around you was considered almost naive. Because the Roman imperial court was not a stable, predictable environment, it was a deeply toxic place of boundless ambition, bitter rivalry, and carefully hidden intentions. Every polite smile across the table could mean genuine loyalty or cold calculation. Every grand gesture of respect might carry a deadly ulterior motive beneath it. And in that suffocating atmosphere, poison became the absolute perfect weapon. It required no loud confrontation, no raised voice echoing in the halls, no drawn blade that could be blocked by a guard. It simply required immense patience. Food, after all, was unavoidable. Even the most powerful, heavily guarded man in the entire empire eventually had to eat, which made every single meal a golden opportunity, not just for sustenance, but for a quiet assassination. And the more powerful the emperor became, the more people actively had a reason to see him permanently removed. Political rivals in the Senate, disgruntled generals on the frontiers, and even members of the imperial household itself were constant threats. In fact, danger did not always come from the outside. In many tragic cases, it came from exactly within, from those closest to the seat of power. Family members, close advisors, personal servants, all had unparalleled access. All had physical proximity. And in a system where the laws of succession could be dangerously unclear, removing a sitting emperor was sometimes seen less as a horrific crime and more as a pragmatic, strategic political decision. This meant that imperial paranoia was not a character flaw. It was a highly necessary survival skill. Emperors quickly learned to expect betrayal, not occasionally, but constantly. The grand meals were prepared with utmost care, yes, but also with intense, suffocating suspicion. The smoky, bustling kitchens were heavily watched by loyal guards. The servants carrying the silver platters were monitored every step of the way, from the hearth to the dining table. The raw ingredients themselves were meticulously scrutinized before they ever touched a flame.
And even then, despite all these exhaustive layers of security, there was always the lingering, terrifying possibility that something unseen had slipped through. That is exactly where the praegustator became completely essential. They were not just there to taste the food, they were there to absorb the emperor's uncertainty. They were meant to stand firmly in that fragile, terrifying gap between the preparation of the meal and its consumption, between blind trust and crippling doubt. Their physical presence allowed the emperor to eat with something vaguely resembling confidence, even if that confidence was entirely borrowed from the survival of a slave. But even this elaborate, cruel system had its terrifying limits. Because what if the poison was slow? What if it was one of Locusta's special, bespoke creations that did not act immediately, but quietly, invisibly over time? A praegustator might consume the food, stand there perfectly healthy for 5 minutes, and show absolutely no immediate reaction, giving the emperor a completely false sense of safety. Hours later, in the dead of night, the true agonizing effects would begin to appear. But by then, the meal had already been fully eaten by the emperor. Which meant that even after the praegustator had done their grim job, a heavy cloud of uncertainty remained in the room, and that lingering uncertainty shaped absolutely everything. Meals were no longer simple, relaxing routines at the end of a long day. They became tightly controlled, deeply stressful events that were observed, measured, and calculated. The basic human act of eating, something so universal and comforting, turned into a careful daily negotiation with the shadow of death.
So, in the grand sweeping narrative of ancient Rome, a sprawling empire built on absolute authority, survival for the elite was carefully managed by pushing the physical risk down to those who had absolutely no voice. But if we finally leave the ancient, sun-baked marble ruins behind and cross a vast gray ocean, moving forward in time to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we find a completely different kind of empire taking root. This one was not born in palaces, and it was not decreed by a wealthy senate. It was born in the deep shadows of modern cities, built not by the powerful, but by the entirely powerless. Long before the American Mafia became a heavily stylized, cinematic symbol of immense wealth, tailored suits, and quiet violence, it began in far less glamorous conditions. It began quietly, carried across the cold Atlantic in the mines, the desperate habits, and the deeply ingrained survival instincts of immigrants arriving in a confusing, overwhelming new world. In the decades surrounding the turn of the century, massive waves of Italian immigrants arrived on the shores of the United States, pouring into the bustling, smoke-filled ports of cities like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans. They stood on the crowded decks of steamships, looking at the expanding skylines, searching for the brilliant promise of opportunity. But what they actually found when they stepped off the boats was something far less welcoming. They encountered a harsh, unforgiving reality defined by grinding poverty, constant discrimination, and a profound sense of isolation. They were quickly pushed into tightly packed, poorly ventilated tenements, living in noisy, overcrowded neighborhoods where steady jobs were incredibly scarce, wages were unfairly low, and daily survival was absolutely never guaranteed. In these chaotic new environments, the official systems of law and order, the police, the courts, the politicians, often felt incredibly distant, deeply unreliable, and sometimes openly hostile to these new arrivals. And history has proven time and time again that when the official system categorically fails to protect you, you are forced to build your own. Within these tight-knit, insular immigrant communities, deeply familiar social structures began to slowly re-emerge from the old country. Many of these newcomers had traveled from the rugged, sun-drenched regions of southern Italy and the island of Sicily, where formal government authority had long been historically weak, corrupt, or deeply distrusted by the common people. In those distant villages, people had learned to rely entirely on informal networks, strict family ties, fierce personal loyalty, and sometimes the quiet threat of intimidation to solve their problems and ensure their physical safety.
Those deeply ingrained cultural habits did not simply vanish the moment they set foot in America. They adapted to the concrete and the brick. At first, these neighborhood networks were small, highly practical, and born entirely of necessity. If a shopkeeper was being harassed, if a family had their meager savings stolen, or if a bitter dispute arose between neighbors, they did not go to the city police. They went to a man in the neighborhood who had a reputation for handling problems. This was someone who could recover stolen goods, settle arguments decisively, or ensure that a small bakery was not mysteriously damaged in the middle of the night. In these early days, these figures were not yet the powerful, wealthy crime bosses of later legend. They were merely local intermediaries, tough men operating carefully in the gray, shifting space between legality and raw necessity. But a distinct, undeniable pattern was forming in the shadows. This vital protection was offered, but it was absolutely never given freely. Disputes were resolved, but they always came with a hidden cost. The currency of this new world was not just cash, it was loyalty, complete obedience, and most importantly, silence. A quiet, unbreakable code began to develop on those crowded streets. Loyalty to the neighborhood above all else, and absolute silence when the authorities came asking questions. Because in this harsh environment, silence was power. The more these fragmented networks operated unseen, beneath the notice of the rest of the city, the stronger and more deeply rooted they became. City authorities often completely ignored them, fundamentally misunderstood their culture, or simply lacked the language and the access to penetrate these close-knit communities, which allowed these small groups to grow, adapt, and organize without any real interference. And naturally, with unchecked growth came ambition. What began as a localized, desperate mechanism for survival slowly transformed into a structured, calculating system of influence. These were no longer just tough men solving neighborhood squabbles. They were actively building systems. They were creating organized frameworks that could control local money lending, manage street-level labor, and eventually dominate entire underground industries. The American Mafia did not arrive on the boats fully formed. It was built piece by meticulous piece, shaped by social exclusion, raw necessity, and the endless pursuit of opportunity. And by the time the wider American public truly noticed what it had become, it was already far too deeply embedded in the concrete foundations of the cities to be easily removed. But if the early quiet years of the Mafia were built strictly on neighborhood survival, the year 1920 provided the monumental spark that turned it into a national empire. The United States government made a sweeping historic decision that would unintentionally, yet fundamentally reshape organized crime forever. They enacted prohibition. They legally banned the production, the sale, and the transportation of all alcohol across the entire country. Overnight, with the stroke of a pen, something that millions of ordinary people desperately wanted and regularly consumed became entirely illegal.
And the basic laws of economics dictate that when public demand stays incredibly high, but the legal supply becomes entirely forbidden, someone will inevitably step into the shadows to fill that massive, lucrative gap. That someone was the Mafia, and the era of quiet neighborhood survival was about to end in a flood of wealth and violence.
At first, the transition into this new, incredibly lucrative era of prohibition was relatively simple for the networks already operating in the shadows. It began with smuggling wooden crates of alcohol down from the quiet, unguarded borders of Canada, producing it illegally in hidden back-alley distilleries, and selling it quietly through trusted back channels. But the concept of doing things quietly did not last long. The public demand for alcohol was simply too massive, and the untaxed profits were far too tempting to ignore. What had started as small neighborhood survival operations quickly exploded into large, highly coordinated national networks, moving enormous quantities of illicit liquor across sprawling cities and state lines. Suddenly, organized crime was no longer just about neighborhood protection. It was about massive, corporate-level business. Speakeasies, illegal, vibrant bars hidden safely behind unmarked doors and basement stairwells, began to appear absolutely everywhere. And these were not shady, dangerous little corners meant only for criminals. Many of them were incredibly vibrant, crowded, and undeniably glamorous. They were filled with live jazz music, dancing, and expensive drinks. Ordinary law-abiding citizens, wealthy politicians, and famous celebrities all found their way inside. And operating quietly behind all of it, controlling the heavy flow of every single drop, was the Mafia. Figures like the infamous Al Capone rose to unprecedented prominence during this roaring period, not because they invented crime, but because they fully industrialized it. Bootlegging became a full-scale logistical operation, complete with complex distribution chains, fleets of trucks, and ruthless enforcement mechanisms to strictly protect the profits. Because naturally, competition did not simply disappear when the money increased, it intensified to a terrifying degree. Different criminal groups fought bitterly over territory, smuggling routes, and control of the most profitable urban markets. Violence became significantly more frequent, much more public, and entirely calculated. Shootings on the street were not random acts of passion, they were cold business decisions. Remove a rival, and you instantly secure the flow of income. And with this massive influx of money came a new, incredibly dangerous level of influence. The enormous profits allowed these criminal organizations to do something far more damaging to society than simply selling illegal alcohol. They began to systematically corrupt the legal system itself. Police officers on the beat could be bribed to look the other way. Local politicians could be financially influenced to lose paperwork. Entire city neighborhoods could operate under a kind of heavy, unofficial control, where the law technically existed on paper, but was absolutely not enforced in practice. Prohibition did not eliminate drinking in America. It simply handed the entire industry over to organized crime. But while the violence drew headlines and captivated the public, it also forced a harsh realization within the Mafia itself. Endless, bloody conflict was terrible for business. Too much chaos in the streets threatened the steady flow of profits and drew the unwanted, focused attention of federal authorities. By the early 1930s, the constant turf wars, like the brutal Castellamarese War in New York, were tearing the organization apart. Into this chaos stepped a pragmatic, calculating man named Lucky Luciano.
Unlike the older generation of bosses who clung stubbornly to ancient Sicilian rivalries, Luciano understood that the future of organized crime was not in endless feuding, but in strict corporate cooperation. He orchestrated the removal of the old leadership and introduced a radical new structure. He helped create what became known as the Commission, a governing diplomatic body made up of the leaders of the major crime families. Instead of constant war, there were now established rules. Territory was formally respected. Disputes were settled at a table rather than in the streets. New York was cleanly divided into the 5 families. Luciano did not invent the mafia, but he modernized it, turning a loose collection of violent gangs into a highly efficient, nationwide syndicate. This restructuring came at the perfect time because in 1933, Prohibition was finally repealed. The easy, massive profits of bootlegging vanished overnight. But the mafia did not retreat back into the tenements. They adapted. They expanded outward into industries that looked perfectly legitimate on the surface, but could be quietly controlled from behind the scenes. They moved heavily into gambling, running vast illegal numbers games and underground casinos that provided a steady, quiet river of cash. But their real, lasting power came from something much less obvious: the infiltration of labor unions. By gaining control of unions in construction, transportation, and shipping, the mafia gained leverage over the entire American economy. If you controlled the union, you completely controlled who worked, when they worked, and at what price. Strikes could be easily encouraged to punish enemies or avoided to reward paying friends. It was absolute control without public visibility. Then there was the glittering mirage of Las Vegas. What began as a dusty, isolated desert town slowly transformed into a glowing epicenter of legalized gambling, and the mafia recognized the monumental opportunity immediately. Instead of operating entirely outside the law, they could now operate comfortably alongside it, and often right inside it. Casinos became the absolute perfect front, legitimate, massive businesses that naturally generated enormous amounts of untraceable cash. Mafia figures from across the country helped secretly finance, build, and ruthlessly manage the early casinos, turning Las Vegas into a brilliant hub where illegal money could flow freely through legal channels, effectively washing it clean. As they expanded, the mafia began to cultivate a strange new image. They started to look respectable. In politics, they traded campaign funding and reliable neighborhood votes for quiet protection. In Hollywood, their influence over labor unions meant they could control production schedules, making them valuable unseen partners to the studios. The media began to shape how the public saw them, not as chaotic street-level thugs, but as well-dressed, honorable men operating by a strict, romanticized code. The mafia was no longer just something to deeply fear. It became something to endlessly watch, to be intensely curious about, and in some circles, even to admire. But beneath the tailored suits and the Hollywood glamour, the cold reality of the system had never truly changed. It was still built entirely on extortion, intimidation, and the quiet, ever-present threat of violence. And eventually, the immense scale of this invisible empire became completely impossible for the government to ignore. In the mid to late 20th century, the tide finally began to turn. Driven by public pressure and dedicated investigators, federal authorities struck back. The introduction of powerful new legal tools, specifically the RICO Act, allowed prosecutors to target the entire organization rather than just individual crimes. For the first time, the bosses at the very top were no longer insulated by the layers of men beneath them. The most devastating blow, however, came from within. The legendary code of silence, omerta, finally began to crack under the crushing weight of long prison sentences. High-ranking members, once thought to be untouchable, turned into government informants. They sat in quiet rooms and detailed the inner workings of the commission, exposing the hidden structures that had protected the families for decades. Court cases dismantled the leadership. The old rackets in the labor unions were heavily regulated and cleaned up. The corporate world slowly pushed the mob out of the glowing casinos of Las Vegas. The era of the mafia's open, unchallenged dominance slowly, inevitably faded into the background. Today, the American Mafia exists mostly as a powerful, lingering ghost in the cultural memory. It has been transformed into cinematic legends, where the harsh, brutal reality of survival and exclusion has been softened by the glow of the silver screen. But their story remains a profound, unsettling chapter in history. It is a story of how a marginalized people, arriving with nothing but hope, found themselves completely shut out of the American dream, and chose instead to patiently, quietly, and ruthlessly build their own empire in the dark. And as the echoes of their history fade into the quiet night, they remind us that the unseen world, whether it is the shadowed corners of a Roman palace, the drafty halls of a Tudor castle, or the neon-lit streets of a modern city, is always moving, always adapting, and always waiting.